Thanks everyone for joining. We're joined with Mr. Kyle Chan. He's a fellow at the Brookings Institute's John L. Thornton China Center, specializing in Chinese tech and industrial policy. He's also a 2025 fellow with the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. His research examines China's tech development across sectors such as AI, robotics, semiconductors, electric vehicles, and batteries, and he's currently writing a book on China's tech industrial policy for the Princeton University Press. He also authors the newsletter High Capacity and has published in journals like Current Sociology and outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, and has also testified before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. So thank you for joining us, Mr. Chan. I will dive right into our first question, which is, for our audience, could you start with like a brief overview on what exactly is industrial policy and what has been both US and China's approach to industrial policy, which includes like goals, tools, and like other factors?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think industrial policy, even though the term is like sounds like it's related to industry, it's much broader and it's about trying to use targeted government interventions to support certain industries, certain sectors of the economy, especially ones where you think maybe the market isn't really solving some big problem or addressing a major social need. So a classic example of that is semiconductors. So um, during the pandemic, there was a huge supply chain shock where it was very difficult for automotive companies all over the world to get access to semiconductors, many of which were made in Asia, but with transport and logistics frozen due to the shutdowns, a lot of auto companies were struggling to get those semiconductor chips. And after that experience, and along with other issues, the United States, for example, decided to launch the CHIPS Act. And the idea there was that semiconductors are so important, they have so many spillovers to the broader economy, they affect so many important industries that it was crucial the United States built semiconductors at home rather than always relying on importing them from abroad, because we discovered that was not a reliable source. And that's something where the markets weren't really addressing this, because from a pure market perspective, there's not really an incentive to want to reshore when you could get low cost advanced semiconductors made elsewhere. And you kind of hope that there won't be supply chain disruptions, but you also don't have the capital and the ability to build up an entire domestic semiconductor supply chain. So that's where the government can step in. And I think there's other good examples, but yeah, broadly speaking, that's sort of industrial policy. And then, of course, the second part of your question, how do the US and China approach industrial policy differently? I think in general, the US is very skeptical of government intervention in markets, and I think justifiably so. I think that there's strong protections for private firms. There are very select cases like antitrust where the government will step in, and obviously health and safety regulation. After the 2008 financial crisis, there was greater banking regulation. But in general, there's a reluctance to have government step in, and especially to try to boost an industry. There might be support for regulating an industry, but to actually positively accelerate an industry, that's something that's not really part of the American approach. In China, it's very different. I mean, the idea is that the state has long played an active role, again, not just in regulating, but like in supporting, in promoting, in accelerating progress in certain industries across the economy, frankly. So yeah, I think they come from very different perspectives, and in some ways there's growing convergence, and in other ways they retain their sort of distinct national flavor when it comes to industrial policy.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. I think that was a great brief overview, and also the distinct nature of US and Chinese industrial policy was also great. Moving on to the next question. China has been a forerunner in industrial policy, especially recently. What is the balance between like native, homegrown Chinese innovation versus adaptation of foreign technologies in China's rise sectors like EVs, robotics, or semiconductors? And could you elaborate this with a few more examples?
Yeah, so I mean, China has tried a mixed approach to industrial policy. Um, it's a combination of building up that scientific foundation for understanding the underlying technologies. So you think about solar or you think about batteries, and there's incredible amounts of public research funding. There are university research programs, labs aimed at specifically the science behind these technologies, and that's been going on for a long time. So, I mean, China's been doing, laboratory research on polysilicon and semiconductors and solar cells for decades. So that provides that kind of scientific foundation. On the other hand, there's efforts to bring in foreign technology and know-how, and so you get these things like joint ventures with, um, say, major global auto companies like think GM and Volkswagen or Toyota. And the idea there is to not just reinvent the wheel from scratch, but to learn from the best and try to absorb, some of their not just sort of like uh, technology that you might write down on a piece of paper and in terms of IP and blueprints, but like how to build things, how to make these sort of advanced products. And so that's been part of the Chinese approach as well. So there's this sort of um, focus on indigenous capabilities, but there's also the strong focus on trying to learn from the rest of the world. And I think, yeah, there's other factors we can get into, but those sort of illustrate some of the mixed approach that China has taken. It's not a single policy or single path, and it also varies sector by sector as well. So, yeah, I think EVs is one where, if you see that as an outgrowth of the automotive industrial policy, then you can see that there were this combination I was talking about of both, scientific R&D and also trying to learn from other countries. In other areas, it may have been more, reliant on outside expertise. Yeah, it just depends on the sector.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I think that was an interesting response. Um, Earlier, you mentioned that the Chinese government has had a lot of intervention um, in industrial policy, obviously. And if you were to pick one concrete example of Chinese government policy or local government initiative that has helped create a globally competitive firm, what would it be?
Oh yeah. So actually, one that I don't talk about as much, but I think is a really interesting case is the high-speed rail case. And there you have a multi-decade program to, again, use these joint ventures with high-speed rail train makers from other countries, so like Siemens or Kawasaki, and to have them build bullet trains in China. And then over time, and partner with Chinese train makers. And over time, that technology and know-how would start to get absorbed by the Chinese train makers. And then one thing that's interesting is that there is this mix of competition among the Chinese train makers themselves. They each were producing different models, often very similar in form to their foreign partners that they form these JVs with, these joint ventures with. And you had this sort of competitive model, but over time it became more centralized. And eventually, all of China's train makers for bullet trains got consolidated to this one giant state-owned enterprise. And the state-owned enterprise, CRRC, I think it's like China Rolling Stock and Railroad Corporation or something like that. CRRC is now effectively the largest global player for producing bullet trains. Now, a lot of that is just for the Chinese domestic market, whereas for the foreign train makers, they are exporting all over the world. But I think there are ambitions for the Chinese train maker to do the same, to start to sell, and they've already been doing that in parts of Southeast Asia, in in other parts of the world. So I think that's an example of creating a global champion, basically, through this process of industrial policy.
Yeah, I think the CRRC is a great example of Chinese government intervention. Moving on to our next question. How do you assess the risks and the vulnerabilities in China's industrial policy model? And are there areas where China still lags fundamentally despite their stronghold in the industry?
Yeah, so there are a lot of risks and vulnerabilities. One is that there's often a large amount of waste and even outright corruption and fraud in the whole process. So, an example is for semiconductors, China has been trying to catch up for, again, not just years, but decades, and has struggled to do so while a lot of the legacy chips, these are older semiconductors that are used in most other sectors, so these are not the AI chips like NVIDIA's, but these are, say, power chips go into the automotive industry or consumer electronics, household appliances, um, vacuum cleaners, like that level. China's really moved up and been able to take over a large chunk of that market. But to try to get to these advanced chips, right, to try to compete with NVIDIA on cutting edge AI chips, China has struggled. And they've tried to pour money into the problem and set up these specialized funds, um, these sort of national integrated circuit strategic investment funds. In China, they're just called the Big Fund for short. And the idea there was that these are areas where VCs are reluctant to invest, right? It's very difficult, capital intensive hardware. So they don't want to get involved. So then you have these Chinese government funds to try to fill the gap and support the semiconductor industry. But along the way, you have people who sense an opportunity to make a quick buck, despite not having the expertise, not having the real technical background to pull this off. And you have cases where you have, you know, uh, efforts to get loans from local governments to buy equipment from, say, ASML, and then use that equipment to get more loans. And then the whole thing might collapse. And the local government is on the hook for having lost that loan effectively. So there are lots of examples of this kind of waste and fraud along the way. I think there's a question about, how do you really assess the return on investment for these programs if you're including the failures and not just the successes. And so that's really important to think about. And then another big problem is that in many areas, China is still catching up, right? So I think even with government support trying to accelerate progress, um, there are industries, like semiconductors or like high-end machine tools or industrial automation, where countries like Japan or Germany have been, slowly but surely at making advancements over decades. And so now China's trying to catch up in some of those areas. So in some ways, industrial policy might accelerate one's progress, but this is always against the benchmark of all the accumulated progress of other advanced manufacturing countries.
Thank you for that response. I think China having some risks in some aspects of the market is definitely beneficial for other countries. Um, Moving on to the next question, what lessons, either good or bad, should U.S. policymakers and entrepreneurs draw from China's approach to industrial policy? And what are some parts of the Chinese model that the U.S. should try to replicate and parts that it should avoid?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the biggest things, and probably the trickiest one to replicate, is to have that kind of stability at the top level in terms of your strategic goals. The way that um, China has been focused on building up a robust auto industry. This has taken its twists and turns, but the fact that China kept going at it for years and years until you get this EV breakthrough. Makes all the difference. I think they could have easily abandoned this effort a long time ago and thrown up their hands and thought this is not going anywhere. And I think for the U.S., it's tricky because we have political cycles, we have turnover in leadership, and maybe even more importantly, there is polarization around issues that related to um, sort of government programs to support certain industries and sectors. So that makes it tricky because I think without that kind of stability, and again, it doesn't have to be that you use the same policies all the time across administrations or across different Congresses, but without that broader long-term push, it's hard to sustain momentum. And private markets, private capital, right? They are reluctant to jump in if they think that the government is going to walk away from this approach. And so you take something like the Inflation Reduction Act, which had spurred a whole bunch of investment in renewable energy sectors in the United States in manufacturing, um, from solar to batteries. And we see a pullback in terms of government support, and then a sort of like difficulty in sustaining some of that momentum because of that. So that's one area that I think we could learn something actually from China. In terms of negative lessons, yeah, I think that we should also learn from some of the failures of crafting these programs in a efficient way. I think that for the Chinese side, I think they've been trying to adapt as they've discovered problems like the kind of waste and even fraud cases I mentioned for the semiconductor program. And I think for the US, we're very careful with taxpayer money. We're careful with issues like fraud and corruption. It's like pretty much zero tolerance. And so, yeah, if there's a way we can be able to still take risks and make these big bets, but make sure we have a robust sort of enforcement and monitoring system. I think we can do all of that. And that's something that, we don't have to, it doesn't have to always be a trade-off of one or the other.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think a lot of, especially the U.S. government, has a lot of limitations when compared to the Chinese government, as well, the political structure is really different. You authored a report on China's AI strategy and how they're adopting a full stack approach. I had two parts, like two questions to this part. Firstly, what's the relative role of the Chinese government and the private sector in this AI approach? And are any part of the stack, whether it's energy, chips, or computing, particularly weaker or stronger when compared to the United States?
Yeah, those are great questions. So maybe I'll start with the parts of the stack comparison, because I think that feeds into to the first question. But yeah, I think overall, right, that report was sort of showing the full range of government support from chips and compute to models and applications. You have all these different policy instruments and tools being used, whether you're talking about government guidance funds. These are special sort of VC-like funds run by the government, or you're talking about building compute infrastructure, say in the Western provinces, which are rich in renewable energy resources, or you're talking about encouraging local governments to set up industrial parks and special zones for AI startups that can, get compute vouchers, that is subsidized access to compute. So, um, so there's all these different tools and layers of the stack that China's trying to target. And compared with the US, in some areas, it's a matter of catching up. And the big one is compute. So I think the US, naturally through private markets alone, has made a huge bet on compute. I mean, you see the estimates of like tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in data centers across the United States. And now these estimates about like the scale reaching something like a half, basically sustaining positive GDP growth single-handedly. These are incredible levels of spending and investment. And the way that the US has access, obviously, to the best chips in the world, coming from, like NVIDIA's Blackwell chips. So that gives the US a massive compute advantage. And then China's trying to catch up in part because they just don't have the level of capital spending, but also because they are facing export controls from the US and they're not able to access those same cutting edge chips. They may have degraded NVIDIA chips, or they might have to use lower performance homegrown chips, maybe made from Huawei or other local chip makers. So in that area, that's one area where government support in China is in some ways just trying to help China catch up on that metric. In other domains like energy, that's something where China is really ahead and faces a totally different sort of scenario than the US, where the US is heavily constrained in being able to build out energy quickly. Whereas for China, this is really what they've been doing every year for at least since the reform era began in the 1970s. So, so while it will be still a huge effort to build out the energy for data centers in China, relative to what China has been doing on the energy side, it's not really going to make such a huge impact. Whereas for the US, it'll really be a big deal. And then to come back to your first question, what is this mix between the private and the public side for AI? And I think it's a really interesting one because, you have these private players that don't seem, at least on the surface, to have that much government support, right? So I think DeepSeek is often pointed to as a classic example where they are a startup that began as a hedge fund that decided to make a big bet on using their actually pretty, by Chinese standards, pretty sizable compute resources to go for AGI, basically. And none of that was directed by the government. So on the one hand, you could say that that's a case of sort of like pure private sector innovation. But I would also point out that the layers of the AI tech stack that have gotten government support go all the way down to the level of supporting basic research and talent development, building this pipeline. There's so many AI researchers now presenting at top conferences like NeurIPS who come from universities like Tsinghua or Zhejiang University, where the founder of DeepSeek went. And so, one can quibble about whether this counts as industrial policy, but I would at least put this under the broad umbrella of government support for a specific sector. In this case, basic research, basic R&D, and developing this incredible talent pipeline that then feeds into all of these other private startups and private tech firms. And then the private tech firms themselves, they do have connections and support from the government, whether you're talking about local government support, trying to help with land or energy for data centers, or you're talking about national level support. So they are in many ways now the new national champions. So you think about Alibaba and Tencent, ByteDance, and they're starting to expand all over the world. And they're doing that with backing in one form or another from the government.
Yep, thank you for that response. I think you mentioned about export controls, which addresses my next question about in the scenario where the US-China trade war escalates further, what parts of Chinese tech ecosystem are most vulnerable, and what parts are more resilient than understood?
Yeah, so that's a really good question and a good way to break it down. And I would add another dimension to that, which is time. So at this moment in time, at the single chip level, that's where China faces the greatest constraints from export controls. Where if you look chip for chip, virtually every sort of major performance spec, whether you're talking about total processing power or you're talking about memory bandwidth and memory capacity, right? NVIDIA chips, um, already the last generation, previous generations of NVIDIA chips are still far ahead of what, say, Huawei Ascend chips are able to do. And um, there are areas where they're catching up, but one thing that China has been trying to do to get around this is to look at the um, uh, node level clusters of chips to try to build out interconnects and especially new technologies like photonics to try to improve connection speeds between chips and between clusters of chips so that you might be able to offset some of your disadvantage in at the single chip level by having these whole compute systems that can still handle the sort of large training workloads, especially that NVIDIA chips are famous for being able to do. So that's one area that has been evolving over time, and it's a difficult space to keep track of because there's lots of rumors about what's coming out. There's lots of questions right now as the US and China sort of have these ongoing negotiations over things like tariffs, but also export controls. So um, even the US export control policy is not domestically so so clearly aligned in one direction or another. Um, so that's one area where export controls have had a big impact, and the question is, will they continue to do so, or might China be able to find ways to, if not get around the whole thing, maybe mitigate some of the impact? Um, then there are other areas where that might be kind of similar, like EDA software. So this is design software for semiconductors. That's another part of the semiconductor supply chain that would be a vulnerability. And at the same time, though, there are some Chinese domestic alternatives. And then for other areas, um, I think that China's open source strategy has started to give it a boost in adoption, not just domestically, but globally. So I think this is a big story to follow, where you have, say, Alibaba's Quen models now getting used in Silicon Valley, in Japan, in you know other parts of the rest of the world, partly because they're accessible, available, they have good documentation. There's sort of an ecosystem now that's being built on them. Um, but I think that's one area where it would be hard to block that, essentially. Export controls might work on denying access to specific hardware, but this is something sort of much broader. And I think it's even causing the US to rethink its approach to AI policy in some ways. And you saw that with the AI action plan from the White House, talking about, you know, uh, emphasizing diffusion rather than merely going for the top performing models. So this is one area that I'm following very closely.
Yep. Thank you for the response. I think tying back into export controls, in response to the United States setting tight export controls on chips, China recently tightened export controls on gallium, germanium, and graphite. From your perspective, are these targeted moves symbolic, or do they signal a long-term shift in China's willingness to weaponize material supply chains?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So I think they do signal a long-term shift, and they show that China's willing and able to um, use control over critical minerals, critical inputs into other sectors, and not just for the United States, but for other countries around the world. So I think in some ways, the gallium and germanium export controls were um, kind of the canary in the coal mine. And what came later with rare earths and things like that, um, you could start to see the outlines of that already with the gallium germanium. And also, it gave us all a sense of how unprepared the rest of the world was for all this. despite all the warnings and despite um, all the calls for building up alternatives or um, trying to stockpile, I think that it caught people by surprise in a strange way, and um, and I think now attitudes have hardened in response to especially the rare earths export controls. So that could be the turning point where um, I think we live in a world now where countries are willing and able to, and they do, um, exercise their control over certain strategic choke points in the global supply chain. And I think, we're just at the very beginning phases of seeing where that might be applied. So I think, to kind of circle all the way back, this feeds right back into the industrial policy question because previously in a world where there was free trade, where there were, you know, maybe normal natural disaster risks and things like that, but not so much these geopolitical risks. It was okay. It was seen as fine to have a globalized supply chain and to essentially offshore or sort of buy import from elsewhere critical inputs. And now that's not seen as acceptable. And so industrial policy might give you a way to fix that problem where markets alone might not be able to do it. And so that's why I think we're seeing so much action on critical minerals and then on rare earths, like the MP materials deal in the United States, trying to build up that capacity at home in a way that wouldn't naturally occur through traditional sort of market dynamics.
Thank you for the answer. I think it was really interesting, and I agree with the assessment of this being a reality check for the United States and other countries. Um, Moving on to rare earths, the rare earth supply chain, what parts of it do you think China will continue to dominate in 2030, looking 5 years down the line? And what parts do you think are going to be contested by the United States and its allies?
Yeah, that's a good question because a lot of that hinges on how much progress can, say, the United States make in a short amount of time. There was really interesting analysis done by a group called Trivium China. They do really good work on China and then also on the impact of Chinese policies and actions on the rest of the world. And they were trying to look at how fast can the U.S. stand up a rare earths processing facility. Um, and again, if not totally make the U.S. independent in this area, at least make the U.S. have a reasonable alternative supply. And their estimates were somewhere in the range of like 5 years, I think, at the very fastest, maybe even slightly less. And it was funny because their benchmark was Chinese rare earths mines, Chinese rare earths processing facilities, and how fast those get stood up. And one big assumption there in their um, in their evaluation was, you know, imagine that all the permitting and the sort of red tape and paperwork in the US was done like almost instantaneously. And then how long would it take to just like physically build this facility and get there? So I thought that was interesting. It also didn't include dealing with the technology side of it. So I think one under-discussed aspect of China's rare earths policy is that they've invested heavily in the technology itself for processing and separating rare earths. And they have, PhD programs, um, researchers who specialize in this, whereas that's really much rare in the United States and elsewhere. So actually, there's a lot of catching up just on the technology front. So I do think it would take quite a long time for the U.S. to really at least domestically, develop a robust sort of like alternative domestic supply chain. At the same time, there's the possibilities for partnering, especially with Australia on this, and yeah, potentially other parts of the world. There's also this issue of heavy versus light rare earths. So this is one area where heavy rare earths is really where China has the greatest choke point, and that's something that even the Mountain Pass mine in the U.S. doesn't have heavy rare earths. So it might solve part of your problem. It might be better than nothing, but there's still a major choke point that's not addressed, and that would have to be addressed in other ways.
Okay, I'm done with my section. I'm going to open the floor to the LAI fellows if they want to ask questions. If you want to ask questions, just raise your hand and introduce yourself and go ahead. Oh yeah, go ahead, Anirudh.
Uh, Thank you for meeting with us. My name is Ani. I'm a senior in New Jersey. My question for you, like going off the rare earth theme, like China has paused its export restrictions on gallium and germanium and antimony until November 2026. How do you think that how do you think that this is going to affect the global chip supply chain and the Western efforts to reduce the dependence on China for these rare metals?
Oh, yeah, good question. So let me just clarify. So you're saying for China pause their rare earths export controls?
Yeah, until suspend its export ban.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's hard to kind of tease apart exactly what China has promised. So yeah, from my understanding, actually, the suspension of the rare earths export controls actually is about two things. One is stopping the most recent October 6th
Hmm.
expansion of rare earths export controls. So that got paused for a year. And then the other thing was wording around giving the US a general license, but it wasn't clear that it actually gave relief to any of the rest of the world. And one thing that's weird is you see Chinese rare earths exports to the US have gone up significantly, but not exports to the rest of the world. So there's some, yeah, there's some kind of difficulty in parsing out like what really happened, what was really agreed to, um, and what were the timelines and who was really affected. So, from my understanding, overall, the whole export control system is stays in place. So, yeah, and that means that in theory, co companies around the world need to get licenses if they want to get rare earths from China or rare earth magnets. And yeah, so we'll see. Maybe there'll be more clarification coming up, but from my understanding, it was actually a bit narrower than I think people had expected. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Mr. Tendulkar, who's a previous guest, please go ahead.
Thanks, Athan. Hi, Kyle. My name is Ashish Chandorkar. I work for the Indian government at the Permanent Mission of India at the World Trade Organization in Geneva.
Great to
I
meet
follow
you.
your work quite, nice to meet. I follow your work quite keenly on X, so thank you for all the insights. Really very helpful. Um, I had a question. I had two questions actually. So one is, of course, there's a lot of talk of industrial policy in the sectors which are emerging, like AI and EVs, etc. But there's also like a lot of negative connotation in terms of the externalities it creates for other economies in terms of overcapacities and deindustrialization and just the usual sectors of the economy, right? So they may not sound like very uh, forward looking from a technology perspective, but they have great impact on jobs and
Mm.
societies. So, do you see that any efforts to do a multilateral kind of control on some of these policies? I mean, like I mean, IMF had a paper saying China spends 5% of its GDP on its
Yeah,
industry
I
policy,
saw
right?
that.
So, in August. So, do you see any rule making happening globally just to kind of contain these policy initiatives? The second question I had was on the rare earths. I mean, do you think it's practical to create a alternative supply chain, even if it's not the US alone, or could a group of countries come together and realistically create like a refining supply chain where 85-90% of the capacities is currently in China?
Yeah, really good questions. And I'm gonna go out on a limb and offer what I think like the ideal solution would be to both of your questions, because I think they're linked together. I mean, look, the many countries are facing similar challenges coming from China, both in terms of facing this wave of Chinese exports and in terms of these export controls and access to critical inputs, critical minerals like rare earths. So what ideally should be the solution? Like imagine like we could set aside other geopolitical differences and some of these other coordination challenges. Ideally, there should be a sort of coalition or a block of countries that could get together. Say, for example, the US, EU, India, Japan, South Korea, you could Canada, you add them all up together, and they create kind of a trade zone vis-a-vis China. So they might have their own tariffs with each other or whatever trade barriers that they negotiate. But at least when it comes to China, they could all band together and have some kind of uniform tariff, essentially, on Chinese goods, or at least certain Chinese goods that they feel like steel is like a classic example, right? I don't think any of those countries I just listed wants to be flooded with steel from China. So I think there's a very strong sort of collective interest in having this kind of block. And then the reason why I suggested being a block is that the problem is the way it's set up right now, each country is trying to come up with their own deal with China. And if one country like the US puts up really high barriers, then Chinese exports go to another country, like to the UK or elsewhere. And so it actually kind of, it's this unfortunate sort of, prisoner's dilemma problem, where if you could just kind of all align around a coherent strategy, then you wouldn't be kind of like hurting each other along the way as you're trying to deal with the China problem. And same thing with the export control issue and the building a alternative supply chain. Literally those same exact countries and regions I mentioned should be working together to create like a buyers group or a whole supply chain network for rare earths. I think I mentioned Australia in that group. So, or if I didn't, it should be. So like that whole group should have some kind of arrangement where they will collectively invest, deal with some of the poor economics of the industry, because that's why we don't have private industries like that in many other cases. It just doesn't make sense from a profitability standpoint. But to me, that would be the ideal solution. I mean, obviously, we're in a unique sort of like world state where it's not just China that is causing some disorder. So, it's hard to coordinate this kind of thing. But to the extent that there could be some kind of coordination really at this block level, and then I think it would be hard for China to not have to respond in some way, or else just face basically getting shut out of these very collectively a huge lucrative market, right? For key products. So that would, to the extent that we could move in that direction at all would be useful.
Thank you.
I think with that, we're done. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Chen. Your insights were super interesting, and our fellows had a great time.
It was great chatting with you. Really wonderful questions. Yeah, and I hope you guys have a happy Thanksgiving, and
Yeah,
good
you
luck with the
too.
rest of the series.
Yeah, thank you so much, and have a great Thanksgiving.
You too.